And so with this as a background, the French and the Brits actually created a joint force of about 20,000 people, about 15, or a little bit more than 20,000, about 15,000 of British troops and about 7,000 of French troops. But what's interesting is they were imperial troops. So within the British troops, there were a lot of Indians, because India was part of the British Empire. And within the French troops, there were actually a lot of people from North Africa, like Muslims, in the army. So they invaded, and when they invaded, they pretty much took exactly the same route as the First Opium War, which is they first took Canton. And Canton, for a few years, actually had this interesting government where the British and the French were the people hitting charge with surrendered Manchurian and Mandarin officials ruling Canton for the British and the French. They took a stop around Zhoushan, which is right off of Shanghai, and they knew the First Opium War, the reason why they didn't get the terms they wanted was because they actually did not actually get to the emperor. So they know they have to get to the emperor. And where's the emperor? Beijing. So where do you have to go? You have to first go to Tianjin, which is the door to Beijing. They went to Tianjin, obviously, with the gunboats, and the artillery of the French and the British was about 200 years more advanced than the Chinese. Like, you know, at the time there was already the guns where it wasn't the muskets where you put the bullet, the bullet and also gunpowder and then shoot. But now there's actually rifles, which is basically the gunpowder is within the bullet. And so if they fought Tianjin, through the fort called Dagu. Through Dagu, immediately the artillery cannot be matched, could not be matched. And so the British and the French took Dagu and went straight to Tianjin. And when straight to Tianjin, Emperor Xianfeng was scared, right? Because you're like right at my door. So it's like, okay, let's negotiate. Let's negotiate. And then he got like a Manchurian official Gui Liang to negotiate. And negotiation, everything is fine, you know, like, because actually, so you want money, okay? The French wanted 2 million taels of silver, the British 4 million taels of silver. We want to trade more into the upper regions because the First Opium War only at southern China. We want to have open ports to northern China and also along the Yangtze River. And we want to be able to, have missionaries around China, which were all fine for Emperor Xianfeng, apart from one thing, which was we want to have long-term ambassadors in Beijing, and we want to see you. And Emperor Xianfeng was like, no way. Like that was like whatever that was like, which is perfectly reasonable now, right? You could have ambassadors, and then you see why was it so unreasonable? Because for Xianfeng, like seeing foreigners is like an insult. And also because foreigners would not do the same ritual of worship to him as the Chinese. Like if Europeans became more and more free, the Western country became more and more free as time went by, China became more and more slavery. I'll give you an example, a very simple example of basically meetings between the emperor and the top officials. In the Han Dynasty, like 200 BC to 200 AD, the ministers in China, at the time it was a bit like the Japanese and Koreans, they all sat on the floor. And so when the emperor talked, or when they were discussing, the officials would also be sitting together or kneeling on the floor together. So it's kind of like equal. So it's the Tang Dynasty in the 7th century to 9th century. But the Song Dynasty, 1000 AD, the emperor didn't like that. They didn't like, I'm sitting down, there are chairs at the time, and I'm sitting down and you're sitting down too. So one day when the prime minister was talking, and eunuch took his chair away from him. And so when it was kind of like a high school prank. So when he was talking, it was done, he looked back and it was like, okay, the chair's gone. So he stood. And so when he stood, everybody else stood. And when everybody else stood, the eunuchs took all the chairs away. So by 1000 AD, emperor sat, officials stood. after the Mongolian invasion, the Ming Dynasty, Zhu Yuanzhang, the founder of the Ming Dynasty, was like a power maniac. So everybody had to kneel in front of him, as they discussed. So was the Qing Dynasty. The Qing Dynasty was a very slave-driven society because it was the kind of primitive at the time in Manchuria before they invaded. And so there's this thing called when you see the emperor, you must do 三跪九叩, 3 kneels and 9 knocks, literally. You knock with your head. And what's interesting with knock with your head is you don't just knock. Knock must make a sound. So officials, the top officials, even like the equivalent of like the vice prime minister and prime ministers, when they see the emperor, they always had a lot of money in their pockets. What for? The money, you pay the eunuch. So that the eunuch would bring you to kneel at an area right behind a tile that was hollow. So that when you do hit your head on the floor, it would make a sound. Because the emperor wouldn't let you finish until he hears a sound. If you don't have the cash to pay the eunuchs, they'll put you in front of a tile with no hollow inside. So you have to knock until it bleeds before it makes a sound. And so you think about it, Xianfeng, from his perspective, an emperor of China is extremely vulnerable and extremely insecure. I'll give you a statistic. Of all the emperors that all call themselves emperors in Chinese history, 45% of those guys, like I think 537 of them, died of an unnatural death. The average life expectancy of someone from ancient China, like Imperial China, not counting child mortality, was 57. The average life expectancy of an emperor is 39. So if you put yourself in Xianfeng's position, why was he so resistant of seeing a guy that would not do the 3 kneels and 9 knocks? That you could actually make sense of it from his perspective. Okay, I'm in a job where everybody wants it. I have absolute power, but the problem is 45% of me historically died of an unnatural death. And if everybody lived until 57, my life expectancy is about 18 years shorter. So a guy like that is extremely insecure. And so this ritual of kneeling and knocking the head on the floor to him is the sign of his authority. And if he loses his authority, that means he loses his life. So that for him is extremely important to uphold. But unfortunately, Tianjin was taken. So he must deal with the terms of the British and French. And British and French, they was actually diplomatically was supported by the Americans and also the Russians. And so the Russians, who claimed that they were doing the mediating, signed a treaty with a guy called Yishan, who was one of the generals of the First Opium War, called Aigan Treaty, that took this whole part of Manchuria, which is equivalent to the size of France. But even to that, like Xianfeng didn't really care. What Xianfeng really cared was not seeing the foreigners in his presence. And so, okay, they signed a treaty, whatever. The most important thing is the foreigners will come back to exchange the treaties and meet the emperor a year later. And the emperor's like, fine, go. A year later, the foreigners like, oh, by the way, we talked about it. Like last year, we're going to come back next year, which is like this year, to exchange the treaties and also to meet the emperor. The emperor's like, no, I'm not going to see any foreigners. And so they try to resist. I was like, how about this? Why don't you do the treaty exchanging in Shanghai, not in Beijing? But the foreigners like, no, we're going to we need to have long-term ambassadors in the capital. Right, which for Europeans were extremely reasonable. Like if you think about it, it's really it's like a culture shock. For Europeans, it's absolutely reasonable. For Emperor Xianfeng, and from all the statistics that I was talking about, was absolutely unreasonable. And it was between the absolutely reasonable and absolutely unreasonable. That's why the fighting began again in 1859. And in some sense, the French and the British then had an expedition again to invade Tianjin and then Beijing. They're a little bit cocky, and so when they invaded, they went through to the, again, Dagu. And Dagu, but this time, the guy who was in charge of the military was a guy called Sengge Renqin. Sengge Renqin is a Mongolian prince of the Qing Empire. He's a descendant of the brother of Genghis Khan. And so he had the best cavalry there was in the Qing Dynasty. And he also rebuilt Dagu where the cannons were higher with better cannons. And so when the British and French came through to Dagu, tide was going down, and so the boats were kind of stuck, and because the cannons were better, the Chinese actually destroyed 4 of the gunboats of the French and the British, and this was actually the first time that China had won against in any kind of conflict with the French and the British. So the confidence of the Chinese was much stronger, much higher of Xianfeng was stronger. The French and the British then left. But that was the cause of the bigger problem, which is China must be avenged. Like, we must teach them a bigger lesson. So more soldiers and more boats came in 1860. In 1860, they've learned it smarter. They've learned it smarter, which is they don't go through Dagu anymore. They go to the north side of Dagu and then went around and took the Dagu, the cannon fortress. And this is probably one of the saddest things in terms of understanding. Sengge Renqin did not defend the northern side because, like, you know what? If they come from the northern side and we're actually fighting on land, I will always win because we have cavalry. So he's still thinking in Genghis Khan's time. So when the British did take over at the north side, they just 3,000 just charged cavalry, just charged to the British. We had cannons and modern guns and rifles. So 3,000 became 7. 3,000 became 7 in like a matter of hours. And in that battle, not a single injury in the French and British troops. Most of the casualties of French and British, it was actually disease and also shooting themselves, as in the guns went wrong and shot themselves. That was most of the casualties. And so they went around and they took Dagu. In Dagu, they lost about 400 people and took Dagu. When they lost Dagu, Sengge Renqin knew that they cannot fight. So he went around Tianjin. He knew that Tianjin could not be defended. And went to Tongzhou, which is this part of China? Is it part of Beijing now? I don't know. Tongzhou, or right outside of Beijing. And then he lost Tianjin, obviously. And then the emperor had Gui Liang, again, this Manchurian aristocrat, to negotiate with the French and the British again. And in Tongzhou, they were talking. Again, it went back to the most important thing. So losing the side of France for Emperor Xianfeng was fine. The biggest thing was the foreigners had to meet Xianfeng and to be in Beijing long term. He couldn't take it. So when he couldn't take it, and then there was more and more negotiation going on. The French and the British did not want to talk to Gui Liang because you actually have no authority whatsoever because it's supposed to, if you're actually negotiating the treaty, you should have discretion. But you always have to go back to Xianfeng. That means you don't have discretion. So he was actually taken away and was put into a guy who would come later called Zai Yuan. Zai Yuan was talking, still about the whole seeing the emperor thing. The emperor couldn't accept it. Emperor was like, screw it, let's do the worst. So what they did was they actually kidnapped all 39 of the French and the British negotiating representatives and sent to Beijing. And when they were sent to Beijing, the top of the negotiator was actually a guy who knew Chinese, a guy called Harry Smith Parkes. Harry Smith Parkes, you probably don't know him as well as you know Australian Milk Company in Jordan. That's the road. Parkes So Parker Street, that is in Jordan now, is actually named after him, who was the chief negotiator of the British in the Second Opium War. He was kidnapped. And when he was kidnapped, of 39, they were actually, half of them died, which we'll come back to that story later. But so when they were kidnapped, the British and the French were furious. So they continue against the battle against the Chinese. So they first fought in Zhangjiawan, and then they fought in Baliqiao, which is now east, Beijing East, which is within Beijing City now, Wuan, Liuwan, like the 5th ring and the 6th ring now. And 30,000 Qing soldiers perished. And within the same battle, the French and British only about, like, the casualties were in the teens. So you can see it's actually basically just a slaughter. And so Beijing